It was 1972, backstage at Madison Square Garden. Minutes before showtime, Elvis Presley froze. A message had just been delivered from John Lennon. Whatever those words were, they hit him harder than any critic ever could. That night, for the first time in his career, the king refused to walk on stage. June 10, 1972. Madison Square Garden, New York City. The crowd of 20,000 was deafening. Flashbulbs cracked through the dark like fireworks. It was supposed to be Elvis Presley's triumphant return, his first New York concert in 15 years. Backstage, the mood was pure electricity. His band tuned up. Stagehands shouted cues. Joe Esposito, his trusted road manager, double-checked the set list taped to the mirror. Elvis, calm but focused, adjusted his white cape and hummed Proud Mary under his breath. Then Joe walked in with a folded note. "This came from the front desk," he said. "Guy said it's from someone named John." Elvis smiled. John Lennon? He guessed. He hadn't spoken to him in years, but the Beatles had always been his boys, his musical sons. He opened the paper expecting something lighthearted, maybe a joke. Instead, his smile vanished. He read the first line once, then again. The blood drained from his face. Joe noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked. Elvis didn't answer. He folded the note carefully, slid it into his jacket pocket, and whispered, "So that's what he thinks of me." The band waited for the signal. His signature, TCB, short for Taking Care of Business. It never came. Elvis just stood there, motionless, the sound of the crowd echoing through the thin walls. A stagehand poked his head in. "Mr. Presley, you're on in 5. But the king didn't move. For the first time in his life, Elvis Presley, the man who had played through heartbreak, illness, exhaustion, looked like he might not go on at all. What could possibly make the world's greatest performer stop in his tracks? What words could silence the king of rock and roll? 3 months earlier, across the Atlantic, a young reporter from the London Evening Standard had asked John Lennon a loaded question. "What do you think of Elvis Presley now?" Lennon didn't pause. He smirked slightly and said, "Elvis died the day he went into the army." It was a sharp soundbite, meant as social commentary. The rebel tamed by fame, the fire cooled by Hollywood polish. But once printed, it lost its context and spread like wildfire. By spring 1972, that single sentence had been reprinted from London to Los Angeles, twisted into something crueler. John Lennon says Elvis is finished. The king is dead. The words cut deeper than most knew. Elvis had admired the Beatles, especially Lennon. He used to say, "Those boys reminded me why I started singing." To him, Lennon wasn't competition, he was continuation. So when Joe Esposito handed him that note backstage, clipped from the Daily Express, Elvis saw more than a quote. He saw rejection. The line was underlined in red ink, "Elvis sold out." That phrase echoed in his head like feedback through a broken mic. He sat down at his dressing table, staring at the mirror framed with bare light bulbs. Behind the reflection, he didn't see the man the world worshipped. He saw the poor kid from Tupelo who just wanted to make music that mattered. Charlie Hodge walked in, sensing something wrong. You okay?" Elvis handed him the clipping. Charlie read it slowly, then shook his head. "He didn't mean it that way. You know John, always stirring things up." But Elvis didn't respond. He was remembering the night in 1965 when the Beatles had visited his Bel Air home. He'd shown them his guitars, jammed to I Feel Fine, laughed for hours. Lennon had called him the reason we ever picked up guitars. And now this. Elvis stood and walked to the door, pacing the hallway. "He said I died, Charlie. Died." His voice cracked on the word. "I gave my life to this, and he thinks I'm just a headline." Charlie tried to steady him. "Maybe he's jealous. Maybe he's just angry at the world. Not you." But Elvis wasn't angry. Not yet. He was hurt, genuinely wounded. He stared at his hands, the same ones that had once held audiences in rapture, and whispered, "You ever feel like the world's thank you turns into a goodbye?" Outside, the crowd began stomping their feet, chanting his name. "Elvis! Elvis! Elvis!" The noise shook the floor, But backstage, there was only silence. When the people you inspired turn on you, what part of yourself do you lose? When your heroes forget you, how do you keep believing in your own fire? Elvis folded the clipping and slipped it back into his pocket. "Start the show without me," he said softly. And for the first time in his career, he meant it. The crowd outside Madison Square Garden was shaking the walls now. 20,000 fans waiting, screaming his name. Stagehands rushed through the corridors. Promoters panicked. But Elvis wasn't moving. He stood in the narrow backstage hallway, his back to the stage door, his reflection shimmering in a glass trophy case. Security guards exchanged nervous glances. Charlie Hodge lingered nearby, holding a towel like a peace offering. "Elvis," Charlie said gently. "It's time." Elvis turned, his expression blank. "He was one of my boys, Charlie. Lennon. He used to write me letters, tell me I changed his life. Now he says I'm dead." "He didn't mean it," Charlie insisted, but Elvis shook his head slowly. "He said I died when I put on this uniform," he said, pointing to his stage jumpsuit. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I've been singing for ghosts all this time." Joe Esposito appeared in the doorway, anxious. They're chanting for you. Promoter says we're gonna lose the venue if you don't go on now." Elvis's eyes flashed. "You think I care about the money?" He stepped closer, voice trembling with frustration. "They think I'm some puppet, Joe. They think I stopped matching the minute I stopped Rebel Lynn. But I still sing. I still believe in this." He slammed his hand against the wall. The sound echoed down the hall like a gunshot. Charlie placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've played through worse. Remember Hawaii? Remember the Vegas pneumonia? You always show up." Elvis took a long breath. "Yeah, but tonight feels different." He walked back toward his dressing room, brushing past Joe. Inside, he looked at the folded clipping again. The red ink stared back at him like a wound that wouldn't heal. He whispered to himself, "If he thinks I died, maybe tonight I let him be right." Joe froze in the doorway. "You're not serious." Elvis didn't answer. He took off his guitar strap, set it gently on the couch, and sat down. The distant roar of the audience bled through the walls, desperate, confused, endless. The promoter knocked again. "They're waiting, Mr. Presley. You have to go on." Charlie stepped between them. "He's not ready." Not ready, 2 words no one had ever said about Elvis Presley. Minutes turned into half an hour. The band stood in a line backstage, uncertain whether to keep tuning or pack up. Elvis sat motionless, staring at his reflection in the dressing mirror. His cape glimmered beneath the bright lights, but his eyes looked empty. He remembered the last time he'd spoken to Lennon, 1965, the Bel Air Jam session. They'd laughed, played bass and tambourine, shared stories about fame. Lennon had called him the king, and Elvis had replied, "You're the prince who'll inherit the crown." Now the prince had declared the king dead. The irony stung like fire. He picked up a water bottle, twisted the cap, then stopped mid-motion. "Charlie," he said softly, "you think maybe I should stop for a while?" Charlie frowned. "Stop? You mean quit?" Elvis shrugged. "If the fire's gone, maybe it's time to walk away before I burn out completely." A murmur swept through the corridor as word spread. Elvis Presley refusing to perform. The impossible was happening. The stage lights dimmed once, twice. The band's opening cue played, then faded awkwardly. No one stepped through the curtain. The crowd began to chant louder, the rhythm pounding like thunder. "Elvis, Elvis." Inside, the king sat silent, lost between pride and heartbreak. Out there, the world waited for a man who, for the first time, wasn't sure who he was anymore. 9:15 p.m. The crowd was restless now. Promoters were sweating bullets. Fans were chanting his name in waves that shook the rafters of Madison Square Garden. But Elvis Presley was still backstage, motionless, cape folded neatly beside him. Then, quietly, he made his decision. He looked up at Charlie and Joe. "Cancel the first set," he said flatly. It was the first time those words had ever left his mouth. Charlie's eyes widened. "You serious?" But Elvis didn't answer. Instead, he walked across the room to the black piano in the corner. The band had brought it for vocal warm-ups, not confessions. He sat down, adjusted the bench, and let his fingers fall gently on the keys. The first few notes came hesitantly, broken, uncertain. But within seconds, a familiar melody emerged. It wasn't one of his songs. It was In My Life, a Beatles song written by John Lennon. Charlie froze. Why that one?" Elvis didn't look up. His voice was soft but steady. "Because I still believe he meant every word of it, even the ones that hurt." The music filled the small dressing room. Outside, the crowd was a distant echo, a sea of strangers calling for a man who, at that moment, just wanted to feel human again. His voice was raw, stripped of showmanship. "There are places I'll remember, all my life." Charlie said later it was the most heartbreaking sound he'd ever heard. Elvis played through the entire song, hands trembling, tears sliding down his face. When he finished, he didn't speak for a long while. He simply stared at the piano keys, whispering, "I taught them how to dream. They taught me how to feel again." Joe knocked gently. The crowd's gonna riot out there." Elvis stood. He took a deep breath, grabbed his white scarf, and looked in the mirror one more time. "I'm going out there," he said. "But not for them. For me." He wiped his eyes, slipped on his cape, and walked toward the stage entrance. As the house lights dimmed again, the sound was thunderous. 20,000 people chanting, crying, begging. Elvis stepped through the curtain an hour late. No introduction. No greeting. He took the mic, nodded to the band, and began singing Bridge Over Troubled Water. The arena fell silent. No one dared to breathe. Every lyric hit like confession. When you're weary, feeling small. He wasn't just singing to the audience. He was singing to Lennon, to himself, to every artist who'd ever lost their way trying to please the world. When the final note rang out, he didn't bow. He just closed his eyes. That night, forgiveness was louder than anger. Because sometimes the most powerful answer isn't revenge. It's a song. When Elvis finally took the stage that night, something in him had changed. The swagger was gone. The smile was smaller. But his presence was electric. He didn't speak to the crowd. Not a single word about the delay, the rumors, or John Lennon. He simply tilted his head, gave the band one sharp nod, and began. The opening chords of You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' rolled through the garden. His voice was rough, almost shaking, but real, more real than it had been in years. Every lyric landed like a confession. Fans who'd come expecting polished Vegas charm found themselves witnessing something deeper. A man stripping his soul bare under white stage lights. Halfway through the song, Elvis looked up toward the ceiling. He lingered on one line, dragging it out as if the words carried weight only he could feel. You've lost that lovin' feelin'. Now it's gone, gone, gone. Charlie Hodge, watching from side stage, said later he'd never seen Elvis so exposed. It wasn't a show anymore, he recalled. It was truth. The next song was Suspicious Minds. But instead of its usual high energy, Elvis slowed the tempo, almost turning it into a plea. He stretched the lyric, "We can't go on together," pausing just long enough for the entire arena to hold its breath. By then, everyone could feel it. Something sacred was happening. When he reached Always on My Mind, his voice cracked, and for a split second he smiled through the tears. He changed one lyric, just one. Instead of, "Maybe I didn't love you quite as often as I could have," he sang softly, "Maybe I didn't thank you." He looked up again, eyes bright with something like peace. After that, the band fell silent. The king stood still, hand on the mic, chest rising with exhaustion. Then, without warning, he said quietly, "I had to remember who I was before the lights came on." No one in the audience understood what he meant. But Charlie did. So did Joe. He'd found his fire again, not in pride, but in humility. That night's show ran almost 2 hours longer than planned. Fans didn't care. They stayed until the final note, some in tears, many whispering, "He's different tonight." The next morning, Newspapers called it Elvis's most emotional performance ever. They praised his voice, his power, his control. But no article captured what really happened behind the curtain. The quiet battle between hurt and forgiveness that played out in real time. A year later, Lennon gave another interview, this time in Rolling Stone. The tone was softer. "Maybe I was too harsh," he admitted. "I loved Elvis. Without him, there's no Beatles." The apology came too late. Elvis never read it. But if he had, he would have smiled, because he'd already forgiven. Years later, after his passing, Joe Esposito found something tucked inside a drawer at Graceland. It was the very newspaper clipping Lennon's quote had come from, the one Elvis read backstage that night. But at the bottom, in Elvis's unmistakable blue handwriting, were 3 simple words: "Still singin', John." He turned pain into purpose, rivalry into redemption. The king didn't fight back with anger, he answered with music. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is grace. 13 years later, in 1985, a team of archivists was cataloging Elvis's belongings at Graceland. Most of it was ordinary jewelry, scarves, fan letters. But behind the grand piano in the music room, they found something unexpected: a framed newspaper clipping. It was the same quote from John Lennon. Elvis died the day he went into the army. But beneath it, written in blue pen, were 4 words that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Still here. Still singin'." Someone had underlined "singin'" twice. The frame was scratched, the glass smudged, but the message was clear. Elvis hadn't just forgiven Lennon. He'd reclaimed his story. That small note became a symbol, a quiet declaration from a man who never learned to hate back. Today, the frame rests in a display case beside his Madison Square Garden jumpsuit. The tiny plaque reads, "He sang through heartbreak. He sang through doubt. And in the end, he forgave through song." Both men are gone now. Lennon, the poet. Elvis, the preacher in rhinestones. 2 opposites who changed the same world. One fought the system, the other softened it. And somehow, both found their truth through music. They never shared a stage again, but their stories stayed intertwined. Rebellion and grace. Rhythm and soul. Fire and forgiveness. Because legends don't just shape music. They shape each other. Maybe greatness isn't about never breaking. Maybe it's about what you do once you've been broken, whether you choose silence or song. And on that night in 1972, when Elvis Presley picked up his microphone again, he made his choice. He sang. If the story moved you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Because behind every rivalry, there's a truth only compassion can uncover. Were you a fan of Elvis or Lennon? Tell us your memory below. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories that reveal the human heart behind music's greatest legends.